Hi, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. I'm continuing my series into Introduction to Methods of Qualitative Research. We're on section 1.5 of my notes. As you know, you can click the link in the description field. It'll take you to the notes. Download the notes, use it to supplement your reading. We're on page 13 of the notes, and we're beginning a new section on Michel Foucault. We've completed two paradigms, two theorists. The initial being Derrida and his deconstructivist approach. Talked about the application of deconstructivism. Some of the main points had to do with the multifaceted nature of interpretations based on particular event ontology, how that manifests in subjective identity, and our understanding of our relationship to our work is important because as qualitative methodologists, we realize that both ourselves as researchers, we have infinitely many ways of interpreting the narrative and stories and data that we receive from our participants, and that our participants' experience of the world is, some of my technology was making noise. The participant experience of the world is going to be multifaceted as well, and it will be itself open to a plethora of sort of interpretations. There is no fixed, finalized, totalizing interpretive account. We move to Kitri Spivak, one of my favorites as well, also assuming a quasi-deconstructivist approach, which is why I grouped her with Derrida. Spivak's account had to do more of ourselves as researchers, less about the participants or data transcription and data interpretation, and more about our own awareness of ourselves in terms of qualitative methodologies. And the importance being that you as graduate students, this is the people that I'm motivated to work for, though I know professors are watching my work as well. The reason for my work is for graduate students. You as graduate students are going to be the next generation of academics, of deans, of professors, of presidents of universities and such. And the idea is for many of us, we will be, and if not all of us, we will be potentially marginalized from within the center. And that marginalization isn't a geographical, space-related, topographic relationship. It's not marginalization out there in terms of an externality, as much as it is, and I gave any number of examples, gender marginalization, sexuality marginalization, race marginalization, theoretical ideological predisposition marginalization. I have made it in the ivory tower. I am in the ivory tower. I represent education. I am education, but my ideological and theoretical predispositions are marginalized from an older tradition. And I talked about the distinction between methodological approaches to information acquisition, the old model being information recall, the new model being information access. I represent information access and not recall, and the marginalization from the center in relation to that discourse. In this, we're going to talk about power. And Michel Foucault is obviously synonymous. He really is, as an individual, and his work is synonymous with power, discourse. This is where you go to understand power. No one, and I've read a lot, no one does it better, in my account, theoretically or even practically, than Michel Foucault. So why not give a small bite size? And for me, small bite size will be maybe 4 or 5 hours. That's small. Small bite size introduction to Michel Foucault's application of his discourse on power to qualitative methodologies, and that's what this section is going to represent. So with that, hopefully we're all on the same page, and that page is page 13, and let's begin. And this is section 1.5. This is section 1.5. And this is the context for power knowledge. The context for power knowledge begins with the relational nature of power. Power is relational. There is no power that is established in a vacuum. There is always a sense in which we understand power in terms of this dialectical relationship. So power is relational. in terms of its relational appeal, it's a dialectic. The nature of that dialectical relation can itself manifest in any number of ways. A dialectical relation can manifest itself, as per Marx, in what's known as a master-slave dialectic. And the master-slave dialectic is one in which you have institutions of power represented by the master and control, and the institution of work needed to generate power by the slave population. It doesn't necessarily have to be a literal slave population, but the idea is an institution of power that requires labor for its own support. The institution of power represents the master aspect of the dialectic. Those individuals' labor who reinforces and buttresses the power represents the slave population. Doesn't necessarily mean to be slave population, represents the slave population. The benefit, however, if you want to put that in scare quotes, is that the slave population has access. Access to what? They have access to knowledge. Right? They have access to the knowledge that supports sort of the system. They understand the process by which things are produced. They are there producing it. They don't have the means of controlling production, but they understand what is entailed in production because they are themselves the producer. So one of the quote-unquote benefits of this dialectical process between master and slave, this is a super 2-second tidy, is access to epistemological foundations of power. They understand power. They don't recognize, the slave population doesn't realize that they have attained an understanding of power, but they understand power well. They have not formalized that understanding. They haven't made that understanding practical in terms of means of production, in terms of unity and the consolidation of information as a vehicle, which is why this dialectical relationship is almost always described in terms of oppression, subjugation, and abuse, right? But that's just one. Another dialectical process with respect to the relation of power is always already the mentor-mentee, teacher-student relationship, right? So you have the mentor-mentee relationship. And the idea of this relationship, mentor-mentee, teacher-student relationship, formally described probably best, most idealistically, in terms of Freire, Paulo Freire. I think that's how you spell his name. Paulo Freire's critique of what's known as the banking concept. And Freire's critique of the banking concept is that relationships of knowledge facilitate inherently, this is Foucauldian in a sense, whether he knew it was Foucauldian or not is irrespective. Foucault laid the theoretical substrate for a discourse on mentor-mentee, teacher-student relations of power. All of this is within power knowledge. Power is absolute. In terms of this relationship, the instructor knows, the student does not know. The student opens his or her mind up for deposits of knowledge. That deposit of knowledge then yields power, but that power is a replication. It's almost like asexual reproduction in biology. There's no new creation. It's not like sexual reproduction, which yields diversity. All you have is a replication of existing knowledge. And Freire challenges this approach to knowledge, and thus this approach to power. Since power and knowledge are inextricably bound, a replication of the exact same means with which knowledge is acquired, this banking concept, yields a second generation exactly like the first. It just becomes institutions of perpetuating and parroting the same thing with no novelty, no contributions, no diversity, no growth intellectually. The realization has to be, argues Freire, that there's a dialectical exchange, right? There's a dialectical exchange between the instructor and the student, and that the student has information that he or she can bequeath to the instructor, and this reciprocal relationship yields new knowledge, new approaches. In terms of the relation of power and the manifestation of these two main paradigms, there's more, but I'm only going to talk about these two. Its relation to the master-slave dialectic and its relation to the mentor-mentee dialectic, both instantiations of power-knowledge, dialectical relationships, pertains to your, as a qualitative methodologist, one. So, the application. The master-slave dialectic, in terms of your interaction with your participant, the participant might not recognize, might not know that they know something. They don't know that they already do know some phenomena. And the idea is part of our interview with the participant is a way of guiding. It's a means of guiding them to a knowledge they don't quite know that they know. The slave population, not to be pejorative now, but the slave population doesn't know that they know the functioning of the MOP, the means of production. They don't realize that they have a general systemic understanding of the means of production, and it's that inability to know that keeps them subjugated. In terms of your relationship with the participant might not recognize, since we're going to be generalizing their findings to a collective population, they might not recognize that they already have the answers to whatever the motivation for our research is. They might already have the answers into how social relationships were overcome in terms of conflict. I do conflict resolution. They might not have an understanding that they already know sort of the organizational culture of the business. They were just doing their duty, but when asked and when prodded for responses, they came to a greater systemic understanding of sort of the structure of the institution. They might not know with respect to, let's say, domestic abuse or interpersonal conflict or interpersonal relations that they had been implementing diversionary tactics in order to protect themselves from further abuse. They might not know that they were doing it. It became intuitive, it became gut, but I recognize as tensions arised and as I felt myself endangered, I was able to implement tactics to distract the aggressor and thus protect myself until I was able to get out of a situation that can end up, bad for both. They might not know that they do this. The idea is to assist your participant, and this is important, right? The idea is to assist your participant to a realization of what they didn't know, right? You want to assist your participant to arrive at some realization that they didn't know that they knew. So for me, in my particular dissertation, so sort of it's the assistance, I'll put this down. The assistance to realization. I don't think there's an A, R-E-L. You want to be able to have your participants arrive at a realization that they themselves knew but didn't know that they knew. So what does that mean? The inevitability of evil was a phenomenological fact that was derived from the participants that I interviewed, all of whom survived Holocaust in various degrees. Some were interned, some fled, some escaped before Nazis, sort of implemented the genocidal campaign. Everybody's story is contextualized within sort of the atrocities from the 30s to 45, 44. Everybody's story contextualized within that historical phenomena. What my participants didn't realize, what I didn't realize, what we co-created, and that's the key, and I'll put that down on the board in a second, what we co-created was a recognition of the inevitability of evil, right? It's something that they did not know, I did not know, prior to our discussion, prior to the interview, that was a phenomena of a shared phenomena, a collectively shared phenomena of their experience. Jason, you just had to be there, says one participant. Jason, I would love for you to understand, but it's impossible for you to understand. If you were there, maybe you would understand. Similar, another participant says. Another participant. I can never explain what this means to you so that you could understand. It the experience transcends anything I could say. We do our data interpretation, we see the emergence of a pattern from these sort of extracted quotes from our participants, and then the realization that evil is ineffable. We can't explain it. You have to be there to understand it. It's something that each of the participants knew. It's something that each of the participants experienced, but they didn't have an ability to formalize their knowledge, and thus they couldn't signify, point to their knowledge as knowing. It's not until our co-created realization, right? It's not until our realization of this phenomena was co-created that they came to know that they knew. And there's power in that, right? There's power in that, right? So the master-slave dialectic doesn't talk specifically about sort of subjugation in terms of economic impoverishment, even though that's its application. Master-slave dialectic really is reducible to those who control via power and manipulation, etc., and those who have an understanding but don't yet recognize that they have an understanding of the very system, both of their impoverishment and the functioning that bolsters power. So this becomes co-creative. In terms of mentor-mentee relationship, via Freire's critique of the banking concept, it isn't that your participant is going to give you information and you're just going to translate this information and publish it for the world. It isn't going to be the case that the participant, is the warehouse of knowledge and we are just asking questions in order to get responses and we sort of regurgitate it, right? That isn't a proper manifestation of power in terms of knowledge. The proper manifestation is, again, co-creative. It is a dialectical exchange, a question and answering as a foundation, and then clarification, mutual points being clarified, mutual points being finalized and refined, such that both participant and researcher come to an agreement about the interpretation of this phenomenon. Let me make sure that I understand participant X. When you just said 2 minutes ago in our interview, ... I'm understanding that you mean ... Is that correct? No, actually that's not correct. Oh, can you clarify for me? Yes, it's that ... Okay, so when you said this sort of change to my interpretation, you meant this then. Is that correct? Yes, that's correct. We arrive at a knowledge, we arrive at something that has been constructed, and that knowledge then yields the power of understanding. And all of human civilization is a testament to the power of understanding. Understanding is power. Knowledge is power. You take something that you know and you implement that, and the implementation of the structure, if it's in terms of social control, if it's in terms of social activism, if it's in terms of products and production, no matter what's a manifestation of, all of what we see, everything, there isn't a thing that we look at day to day that isn't itself a manifestation of understanding. If you wear clothes, someone figured out how to stitch it. If you're talking about fabricated metal, someone understood welding and fabrication. If you talk about ideas, if you talk about social mobilization, social activism, people sat down and engineered the way in which this might unfold. Everything that you see around you every single day is a consequence of the recognition that understanding can be operationalized and made practical and physical and material in the world. So without that knowledge, there is nothing in the world, right? And without anything in the world, there is no power. There's nothing. You can't even conceptualize it. You literally can't even conceptualize it. Thus, power knowledge is like space-time. You can't separate space-time. It's a union, space-time. Power knowledge, you can't separate properly power from knowledge or knowledge from power. Power knowledge is a unit in and of itself. The idea is co-created learning rather than the dictation and recitation sort of formula, right? So that establishes the first, right? Power is relational. I think that should be clear. The two main constituent elements of relational power is a realization of its dialectical nature. The dialectical nature is best, there's many other levels, but they're the two most important, two most famous accounts of this dialectical manifestation. There's master-slave dialectic and the mentor-mentee, teacher-student dialectic. Okay, number 2, knowledge is an effect of power. But power is also an effect of knowledge. It is a biconditional relationship. So if we talk about knowledge and we talk about power, it looks like this. Right? Knowledge informs power, power informs knowledge, and here is the claim. The claim, knowledge is power necessitates identity, and the two are not the same. The unity of the two is something bigger than its component parts. To talk about if K then P, and if P then K, each constituent relation, and this is a little bit more logically technical, so you just have to take my word for it. Each conditional relation in and of itself isn't powerful enough. It does not capture the biconditional relationship. The biconditional relationship of both parts is greater than the sum of each part, right? So the biconditional relationship that unites power and knowledge is something actually different than, it subsumes either if K then P or if P then K, right? It's larger. Just take my word for it. I can't go into the logic of it all now, but it's sort of a mathematical fact, right? It just is. So power knowledge as a unit is bigger than the relationship wherein power manifests itself in continued understanding, or what I do, or the use of knowledge, the use of power, the use of understanding to create conditions for power. Institutions of power implement both. Number 3, the social construction of subjectivity. This is a hugely, hugely important point. And this probably will be the most applicable in our discussion of its application to qualitative methodology. So this is like super, super important. Number 3, culture, religion, education, economic, class, etc., all socially constructed. We understand from previous lectures that social construction is itself the force with which individual communities of human beings, right? Western communities, Eastern communities, religious communities, atheist communities, collective pockets of people construct narratives via any number of processes in which our interpretation of the world is changed. Foucault, this is what he does best. You can imagine that there was you don't even have to imagine, as a historical fact, it used to be the case in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, DSM. I think it was DSM 2.1, something like that. Homosexuality was pathological disorder. It no longer is. The pathologization of homosexuality isn't a disorder because of a biologically constructed fact. No. The depathologization of homosexuality is a consequence of social activism, social movements, more inclusive practices, because of people like Michel Foucault and his history of human sexuality, because of people like Simone de Beauvoir and her contributions and such. It is a consequence. The facts of our social understanding is transformed by movements and individual people, and thus the identity of the person. Personal identity is actually not this. Where's my red marker? Personal identity is not this. This is a lie. This is not what personal identity is. It's a fabrication. Our personal identity is more like this. Our personal identity is more of Our personal identity is more of the combination of a bundle of our individual experiences via David Hume. So Hume has an account of a bundle theory of identity. You can look, if you're interested, in the narrative of the ship of Theseus, which is an Aristotelian discourse. Theseus. The ship of Theseus. Read that in your leisure so you have a better understanding of the bundle theory of identity. But our identity isn't sort of a consequence of just straight deliberation. It's not to critique Derrida's discourse, but it's not just self-reflection and deliberation that serves as the condition for the conferral of identity. Our identity is itself externalized in society. We couldn't even formalize the conception of I via the critique of Descartes' cogito without an understanding of social relation. Thus, the relation of power formalizes the relational nature, this dialectical nature of power formalizes personal identity. Without that dialectical nature, we wouldn't even have a conception of self. I am who I am because I have myself as juxtaposed against the social backdrop. It's because I am me and I am not you that I come to know who it is that I am. That sounds sort of traditional, sort of hokey philosophy, but the realization is I am a collection of my experiences, and the collection of my experiences undergoes social interpretation, right? That part of your experience, Jason, is bad because we in society condemn it. So you can imagine theoretically that I was or am a homosexual male. I have homosexual intercourse with other men, and insofar as I have homosexual intercourse with other men, society at one time deemed that act as being pathological. Society said that that act, the act of homosexual intercourse between men or women, that act of homosexual sex is fiendish. It's a perversion. It's a pathological distortion of some norm, some acceptable mode of sexual congress between human beings. And it would be impossible for me not then to confer pathology on my own identity. I am a pathological person. That's the whole point. This is the whole punitive nature in terms of one sort of very ominous aspect of psychology, which is the diagnosis, right? The diagnosis has the power to dehumanize the individual. It might not be intended to, but the power of the diagnosis is one of pathologizing, of condemning, of ostracizing, of marginalizing the individual, because one aspect of that individual's identity does not conform with social norms, and as such, the identity of the person becomes pathological, becomes deviant, becomes malicious. And this is precisely what Michel Foucault is fighting against. The power of the narrative which would demonize my subjective identity. It's not about the act that I performed. It's not that I had interracial. Even interracial sex, as retarded as that is, that concept. Interracial sex was wrong. Homosexual act was wrong. And it's the idea that it's not that we're condemning just the act, we're conferring identity of the individual from the act. So insofar as we demonize the act, we demonize the individual. Thus, marginalization is easier, thus exploitation is easier, thus assassinations and killings and genocide and you name it is easier because I am not you. You're pathological, I'm normal, I'm the standard bearer, you're the deviation, you're the deviant, or a member of the deviant population, and thus I can forego moral accountability because there's none to be had. This is a more thorough, and this is itself even generalized. I can't go through the whole bit, but you recognize that the dialectical nature informing subjective identity is a relationship between society and those who control societal norms and personal identity, where personal identity is tied to individual acts of experience, and those individual acts of experience are themselves deemed as moral or immoral by society. Society has the power to confer pathology on subjective identity, right? Mouthful, technical, it's no ghetto philosophy today, but this is what we need to challenge. In your research with your participants, one thing that you can do is to mine the narrative in which an individual can speak of and have the opportunity to talk of the pressures and the ostracization of subjective identity. They told me I was vile. Transgenderism now, not even homosexuality. Even members of the homosexuality community, homosexual community, LGBTI community, the T is still for many too radical. The transgender, transsexuality, still even for most too radical. There's some still deviation and perversion in that. And I've done lectures on this in terms of sex reassignment surgery and the preconditions with which SRS are needed. It isn't just living in the role of the opposite gender for X, a year or 2 years. It is still the stigma, still the stamp associated with there's still some perversion. And we look at transsexuals as being deviant, right? You're masquerading as the other gender. There's still some maniacal, devious aspects. And we confer that not to the desire, the need to be recognized and live fully as the other gender. We rather shift the focus on a deviance in the individual to present him or herself as something that he or she is not. Such that really when it's done, we want to say, he's a woman now, but he really is a guy. He's not really a woman. She's not really a man. They're just pretending to be. When in fact, no, I've transformed myself. I actually am a man now. Or I've transformed myself. I'm actually a woman now. We still have an inability to see that transformation, and what we do is we demonize the individual as being deviant, as being deceptive in his or her nature. And that's something that we need to change, right? So that is a huge, 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 Michel Foucault, most of his work is on number 3, sort of the conferral of subjective identity within this dialectical relation is a consequence of personal identification in association with the social norms and narratives that inform personal subjective identification. That should be clear. Number 4, power network. And I want to read this. Let's see what's on the next page. Power network, and this is a direct quote, connects and disconnects, regulates and produces certain conditions or rules, connects or disconnects, regulates and produces certain conditions or rules for living in the world. A power network is the institution of the regulation of power. Right? It becomes inherently institutional. Power manifests itself necessarily and always in institutions. It transcends the individual. It transcends even collective groupings of individuals. Power becomes institutionalized by its nature. It's bigger than even collective groupings. It's bigger, obviously, than individual people. It's bigger than kinship and ethnicities. It institutionalizes itself. And its power, the question, and I'm not going to go into this because it's its own discourse. The question is, how does it manifest? In my last lecture series with respect to the theoretical relationship between ethnical identity and nationalism, we talked at length about the transformation of ethnical power into national power and the way in which ethnical identity and ethnical relations via territorial, kinship, religious, linguistic identification manifests itself in national identity. What we have is initially a biological root for distinctiveness. I am like these people and not like these people. That biological root for distinctiveness, whether it's justified or not, it's clearly socially fabricated. There is a myth, there is a cosmogony in this narrative, facilitates the precondition for distinction. Group A, Group B. those distinctions, once manifest and justified within our biology, so that you have A, B, and both having root in sort of biological distinctiveness. Once we have these separations in ethnical identities, we recognize that the consolidation of ethnical identities manifests itself in its greatest form, if you will, in national identity, right? So that the nation then transcends, in many instances, but not at all, transcends ethnical identity. So we have the transcendence of ethnical identity in national identity. And I talked about an inversion, I'm not going to talk about that now. The national identity preserves, if it's done well, it preserves the distinctiveness of populations. If it's done well, it preserves the distinctiveness of populations via inclusion. Inclusion as means of power. It preserves inclusion as a means of fortifying its own power, right? So it's included, and as such, it establishes a network, a frame. This becomes a network, one binary network. You can imagine we're talking about circuits. The whole idea of circuits is that one aspect of the circuit is connected to another aspect of the circuit via any number of relations. This is exactly how it works, but socially. The network is itself built on, the foundational root of the power network is itself built on inter-ethnical relationships, inter-religious relationships, I would say probably to a less extent, but primarily inter-ethnical relationships and inter-socio-linguistic relationships, especially now dominating 2013 and 14, the 21st century. It's the ability to speak any number of multiple language, which is the mode of power conference. If you can speak, 10, 12 languages, oh my goodness, who doesn't want to employ you? You're never going to starve, because you readily lend that ability to establishing connections. You readily lend your ability to establishing network. So that power network itself is built on this biological distinctiveness that is itself ethnical and linguistic, primarily. The ability to tie the ethnicity and the language together establishes a connection. Multiple connections establishes networks. The organization and the regulation of those networks requires institutionalization, and thus power manifests itself in the institution. Okay, so that's number 4. That's the quick and tidy. It's quite a bit. And I don't want to deconstruct it more than that, because I think that's pretty much good. So in terms of top of page 14, this comes from Archaeology of Knowledge. 1. Knowledge is that of which one can speak in as discursive practice. We have to emphasize that knowledge and power yield practice. They are the conditions with which the satisfaction yields practice. Something that is done in the world. Something that formalizes and regulates how people conduct themselves. Right? So in the sort of East-West discourse, this is sort of an obvious example because I want to use something that's obvious. One practice is the way in which modesty is preserved in the Islamic world, and the way in which we talk about modesty, if we even talk about modesty, in the West. So you'll have discussions on the role of the hijab in veiling and protecting and safeguarding a woman's modesty, protecting the woman from the sexual gaze of the man. Whether it's just or not, I recognize there's a tremendous amount of argumentation about the validity of any of these points. I'm not going to get, and I'm not interested in any of that. But you look at the hijab or the burqa as a means of protecting that woman from sexual objectification, right? Preservation of modesty. In the West, the interpretation of that is one of, and the way in which we talk about this discursively, is one of oppression and subordination. Look, that woman is oppressed, because when we see her in the hijab, when we see her, we, the West, see her in the burqa, we think to ourselves, don't you want to be free? It's not the case that every single woman in the Islamic world holds those beliefs. There are some women in the Islamic world who would rather not be covered, but do so because of social practice and punitive retribution for not adhering to some laws. I'm sure there are any number of women. But to generalize that Western discursive interpretation across all women in the Islamic world is a foundation for conflict. Why? Because there's any number of women, and this would make great qualitative research, there are any number of women who do not view and who genuinely do not believe that being covered and preserving their modesty in wearing the hijab or the burqa is a manifestation of their subjectification, is a manifestation of an abuse of power. And of course we'll say, oh, that's because you've been brainwashed and you don't really have an opportunity to think liberated. But insofar as we reinforce that and we deny the individual her interpretive experience of her own life, we then dominate. So the idea is, in terms of the discursive nature, there are going to be two sides to the story. And the attempt to deny a narrative that doesn't fit with your overarching theoretical paradigm, your overarching system of beliefs, in order to protect your paradigm or in order to protect your beliefs, institutes another layer of domination and power. If a woman from the Islamic world says, no, I wear this burqa because I wear this hijab because it's something I want to do, it's something that I believe in, and I'm going to prove it to you because when I come to the West, even though I know I don't have to wear it in the West, I'm going to continue to wear it in the West, not because of fear of retribution, or not because of fear of honor killings, or not because of fear of some other, phenomenon, because I want to do it in preservation of my beliefs. There is nothing one can say other than she believes that. She is willingly living in such a manner, and thus there needs to be a recognition of her discursive process, so that even the discursive manifestation of power, right? Power, knowledge manifests itself in practice. The discursive nature of talking about practice. So we would even the discursive nature, even the discussion about practice itself institutes another layer of power. So power reduplicates itself. Power, it propagates itself. It entrenches itself. So that even in talking about the condition of power, the very conversation about power evokes more power. It evokes more structures, protecting itself, defending itself, attacking other institutions of power as such. So, I mean, if you think about the way in which power is propagated in just the discussion of practice, I mean, you could do some amazing, amazing qualitative research on just that, the propagation of power in the discussion of practice, right? You wouldn't be able to recognize the importance of this systemic inherent ability without first recognizing that power is in the position to propagate itself, to entrench itself, to fortify itself. And irrespective of your beliefs, the truth of the matter is, institutionally, anything that manifests in this world manifests through power. There isn't a thing that you can look at, there isn't a thing you can even think of that doesn't have some allegiance or complete allegiance to some individual or multifaceted institution of power. It could be political power, it could be religious power, it could be academic power, it could be economic power, the four main power sources, right? Any one of those four are all for it. I mean, all for in conjunction is like the uber sort of power. But those four institutions account for everything. They account for everything. And everything refers to one or all of those four sources. Number two, quote, knowledge is, quote, the domain constituted by objects. That is, objects of knowledge. You recognize, and I can give a religious example because I don't want it always to be necessarily secular, so I'll give a religious example. Whether you believe in this or not is irrespective. I recognize there's a counterexample for this argument, but just to be fair, so you have a complex, I'm not really a good artist, you have, let me see how that will go. You have a complex structure. I can't draw. So imagine that this is a gear. Right? So actually, I guess the best way to draw it would be, yeah, I can draw it. Hold on. Okay, so you have a gear, you have this very complex structure. Perfect. So you have a very complex structure, and you're walking in the world one day, and you stumble upon this complex structure. And you think to yourself, I compare this complex structure to the rest of the natural world, and I recognize that this complex structure looks nothing like the rest of the natural world. And this is a design. And we immediately posit a designer as the co-creative force to the design. We understand, we co-create, we create a condition in which we identify a design, and then we extrapolate from the design, the designer. Any number of conceptual problems with this argument. It's the designer argument. I'm fully aware of all of them. I'm not going to get into it at all in this discussion because I'm not really going to take this theologically. The idea is one thing, whether you believe in God or not, whether you believe in gods, plural or not, one thing is, from this, what is normally a theological argument that no one will object to, is the relationship that this object, the complexity of which is itself a product of something smarter, something bigger. Religious folks say that something bigger is God. They say that that something bigger is gods, plural. Secularists say that the object, the complexity of this object, is a consequence of a designer, but it's a biological, physical designer. But more importantly, that it is the product of the designer's knowledge and will. Right? So it's to no surprise that Michel Foucault, which I didn't incorporate in this section of the lecture series, or I don't think in the lecture series at all, takes this realization and writes a book called Will to Knowledge. That idea of a will to knowledge is itself a realization that the objective complexity of the world, in terms of secular world, in terms of non-transcendental, non-religious world view, is itself a realization that the mind and the will creates objects of complexity. It creates the bridge. It creates it will probably create nuclear fission. It will create, who knows? It might create synthetic artificial life. It might create synthetic planets. There's no limit to what the will to more knowledge can actually create in the objective world. It could potentially be feasible that there is a planet, this is really stretching it, there's a planet artificially created by human beings, populated by artificial human beings. If you think about the absurdity, and thus this is where the godlike stuff comes in, right? Could we actually create synthetic life? Yes. Could we possibly create a synthetic planet? I was watching Sci-Fi Channel, this is where this came in. Barring it, it would have to take huge calculations because of, gravitational force, and we wouldn't want to create a planet that would disrupt sort of the orbit of all other planets, but I'm sure physicists could figure out how big it would have to be and the weight that it would have to be and how to... Can you imagine a world in which... And it is possible, obviously, this is a possible existence, sort of via Leibniz's discourse on possible world existence and the actual logic of possible world semantics. it is a possible existence to talk about, theoretically, artificial world populated by artificial people. But the point is, at that moment in time, the complexity of that world and its inhabitants is a consequence of the will to knowledge. That thing became real because, irrespective of God, right? But the same holds true if you believe in God, so there's parallel here. But irrespective of God, that functioning system came into being for one and only one purpose, as a consequence of one thing, the will to know more. And that will to know more manifested itself in the world as something real. And that's the power of all power. Knowledge is power. It's the only game in town. It was only the game in town, and it will forever only be the game in town, right? It's that. Number 3, also the space in which the subject may take upon a position and speak of the objects with which he or she deals with in his discourse. The idea is that individual people are in relationships with the objective world, not just other people, right? It isn't just, a lot of qualitative methodology talks about this. I would say, let's say 98%, I'm just throwing out a number, of qualitative methodologies pertain to the relationship between people. So it manifests itself in international relations, it's still people. It manifests itself in organizational cultures, people in business, it's still people. Very little bit of qualitative research, and again, I'm making up the statistics here, a tremendously significant reduction pertaining to the relationship between people and the objects in the world. I think a great qualitative methodology might be, and I saw this on some channel I was watching, maybe like, I don't know what, it might have been Obscura on not TNT, like A&E, has to do with sort of, not Marxist object fetishism, but you can imagine if we're going to be creating artificial life in the next couple of years, that we could logically talk about, it's crazy that this is actually becoming viable, and it's not so much sci-fi as it was before. They have, I'm going to write this down, just going to show you a bit of my own sort of perversion, I guess, but I have no shame. I really don't, because it's not perverse. It's the idea, they're called real dolls. They actually have like a website, a corporation that specializes in making sexual dolls. Good feminist critique here. Can you imagine what it would be like to talk and interview with people who had sexual intercourse with inanimate objects as their main source for sexual activity? So it's not that I masturbate. It's not that I have sex with opposite sex. It's not that I have sex with the same sex. It's that the majority of the sexual intercourse that I have are with objects. Oh my God. Can you imagine what that would be like to publish that dissertation? Oh my God. It would be insane. I don't mean to blaspheme by saying, oh my God, because I know that's blasphemous for some people, so I apologize if that came across. Oh my goodness, think about what that dissertation would read like, right? People who primarily have sex with objects and are fulfilled, right? So you go to realdoll.com, you see if you can, you probably can't get access to their member lists, but you try and identify people, put out a call for papers or a call for participants, people who don't mind sharing the fact that they have sex with, synthetic, latex dolls, and use that as a means for setting the conceptual foundation with which sex with this new, possibly socially interactive entity might be grounded. Right? If we're already having sex with latex dolls, and before that we were having sex with sort of inflatable dolls, you can see you go from inflatable dolls to real dolls to actual sort of, I don't know, android robot sex. I don't know what it's going to be, probably android sex. What that might be like. Very bizarre, very good discourse, feminist discourse, very good sort of psychological discourse into maybe that will become the new pathological thing that the community will say, no, is a bad thing, and people will need to revolt against that, and blah, blah, blah. The idea is object relationships, right? We are intimately connected, more so in the West, with the relationships that we have with objects. Think about hoarding. Think about, any number of, adult, cosplay. Think about the relationship that many, many adults have with inanimate objects and the satisfaction that we get from a relationship with inanimate objects. The movie Her is coming out. And the movie Her is, hold on a second, I have to do this. Mom, I'm standing in the office in front of the camera talking to the world now, answering your call, so I can't sort of talk because the camera's rolling. And I'm actually going to publish this, so, Mom, can you say, hold on a second, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah, hold on a second. Just hold on. I'm trying to put you on speaker. You still there? I think I lost her, but you heard her. That was Mom. You gotta get the phone from Mom. You don't stop the lecture from Mom. But Mom's she gotta wait for a little bit. But you get the idea. The idea is, in terms of object relationships, this is a good condition for qualitative research. It's cutting edge, it's new, no one's really doing it. I don't know of really anybody that's trying to formalize this discourse to the extent that it should be formalized. And for those who are doing it, shout out to whoever you are, graduate students, leave a paper trail, write some dissertations on that topic. I think it'd be cool. Number 4, also the field of coordination and subordination of statements in which, as proportions appear and are defined, applied to, transformed, right? The idea is that knowledge is a field of coordinated activity. Knowledge is the ability to coordinate. You have to forgive me again, sorry. Mom, I'm filming right now. Can I call you back? Mom. She can't hear me. I'm going to shut this down. Sorry, no more. Let me turn off the phone. And I'm not editing this out either, so. But I shut the phone off. The idea is we're coordinating activities. We're coordinating relationships with any groups, members, individuals, and knowledge is a consequence of that coordination. That coordination, the way in which things are coordinated and come into being, is itself a root for knowledge, and you might be interested in talking about that. So also the field of coordination and subordination of statements, the things that we say, the things that we do, appear and are defined, applied, and transformed, is itself a manifestation of knowledge. Knowledge is the way in which we take our mission statement of the company, the mission statement of the business, the mission statement of the university, the national statement of who we are, and coordinate it with our social practices, and coordinate what we say with what we do. It's the idea that we are committed to social service, we are committed to uplifting the community in which we do business as a mission statement for the company, and we coordinate that mission, we coordinate that sentiment and those statements with our actions through people who help us realize that mission. Right? That's a huge repository for discourses on power, and you can imagine that 21st century philanthropy and the ways in which it manifests possibly social change would be a good condition for qualitative analysis, right? 2 more points and then I'll break and talk to Mom. Number 5, the possibilities inherent within the linguistic community. Don't want to spend too much time on that. The linguistic community, as we know, is the force for social construction. It is the language of the community that creates the change in our society, so it's all reducible to, everything is reducible in terms of social construction. It's grounded in and reducible to the most fundamental, basic aspect of social construction, which is the community of speakers. And it is through this community of speakers, and thus thought as a manifestation of speech, that we arrive at social change, social mobilization, collective social organization, all of which obviously manifests itself in power. Right? There is no power without social mobilization. There is no power without social organization. There is no social organization or social mobilization without thought. There is no thought without language. There is no language without a community of speakers, and thus the bottom, the basis, the point at which everything is distilled is the linguistic community. The linguistic community is the source of all of this, right? It is the source. And thus, number 6, and I'll break, there is no knowledge without a particular discursive practice, and I described that, right? The discourse, I erased it, it was over here. But the discursive practice, the practice is itself a consequence of power knowledge. The practice itself yields and propagates power by allowing us access to pick a side. Should they wear hijabs or no? Should they tell us that we can or cannot wear the hijab? The discussion creates and reifies potentially opposing forces of power, and then the synthesis of which is the field of sort of international negotiations, reconciliations, intergovernmental interrelations, IR, all of that. So I'm going to pause at this point, talk to Mom, then come back and pick up where I left off. So middle of page 14, two forms of knowledge. This is indebted to Aristotle's distinction in knowledge. I want to discuss this because it applies, right? And specifically the application to your qualitative methodology is extremely important, right? So the two forms of knowledge. The first form of knowledge is what's known as general knowledge. General knowledge, practice knowledge. It is the basis for propositional contingencies, which means it is the basis with which what we say refers to stuff in the world, or what we say refers to ideas and concepts, right? So this general knowledge is sort of the words, I'm sort of generalizing this. It's referent to things, or it's reference to ideas, to make it really simple. The basis of theoretical development is grounded in general knowledge. It's funny, I was talking to a friend about this point exactly a couple days ago, and she made a really good point. The way in which we formulate abstraction is by taking the things that we know generally and sort of transmuting them, transforming them, so that what is known generally can become abstract. This is really a good sort of Foucauldian account of our knowledge. Generally speaking, we arrive at our theories and our ideologies, we arrive at our axioms and insights mathematically and socially, scientifically, from observation. Observation becomes the root with which we then formalize our abstractive ability. And the point is, any theoretical discourse, any understanding beyond theory of just self-realization is itself rooted in observation. The qualitative application to this is huge. The participant in your research paradigm will have become who they are. They will have identified and reified their own identity as a consequence of this practice. And what is the practice? The practice is the manner in which they observed the world, and the observation of the world influenced who they became. So I had a student a couple years ago who wrote his PhD under me about child soldiers, and you can imagine a young child trained to be a killer. And the young child kills because he has to. Maybe she, but more likely he. So the young child kills indiscriminately. It's discriminated, I would imagine. There's targeted people that need to die. And the young child does this because this is how the young child was raised. This is how the young child was, they found themselves in a social condition. It could be tribalistic, war, it could be what have you, where this was the objective of the child. The child had to do it or else, or the child willingly, did it or else. You have that idea. And it's traumatic, sort of the experience in and of itself. The observation of that destructive capacity at such a young age. I have in my office a picture of a young boy holding the Kalashnikov, the AK-47, pointed at the camera, black and white, and he's ready. That's the most dangerous force on this planet. An atomic bomb, a nuclear bomb, any amount of terrorist factions pale in comparison to a 10-year-old, 14-year-old kid with heavy firepower smiling at the prospects of killing you. There is nothing more horrifying than that prospect, because he doesn't even recognize his lethality. He doesn't recognize how dangerous he really is. It's fun. I have the picture. It's fun. And maybe if I remember, I might incorporate that picture into this lecture series. I'll probably forget. But the idea is, it's a tremendous force. You can imagine as the child gets older, the child recognizes, and this was the dissertation, oh my God, look what I did. I am the instantiation of all evil. I killed X number of people before I was, 18. Hugely problematic for the identity of that child. What ends up happening is, it's a recognition, this basis for sort of theoretical abstract development. In terms of this basis for personal identification, the most theoretically abstract development is what Maslow sort of codifies and articulates as self-actualization. The actualization of my own self requires that I reflect on the observations of my life. And imagine if the observations of your life include killing guy X, killing guy Y, killing guy Z, killing guy this, killing, all before I was, my brain sort of formalized itself as being an adult. This person, the trauma of his or her life is going to make it almost impossible for him to go through the process of socialization, for him to become a well-functioning, meaningful contributor of society. I mean, it's going to be nearly impossible. What his dissertation did, I'm giving you a great example because he did his dissertation under me. He graduated with his PhD on this basis, was a recognition that the development of self-actualization as theory, as applied to this unique individual, required a transformation in how he saw the world. He had to transform how he saw himself. He had to forgive himself of all the atrocities that he had committed in order for him to be a meaningful contributor to society, and he ended up being exactly that. He ended up being someone who gave back and tried to make amends for what he did. It doesn't have to be as salacious as that. It doesn't have to be as sort of ridiculously over the top as an example like that, but you get the idea that in terms of personal actualization, the development of theory, your theoretical dissertation, if you are so inclined to write one, is the attempt to generalize, to create a theory, maybe grounded theory, of the process of self-actualization from traumatic childhood. I just gave you a freaking gem right there, right? Think about that, right? The process of self-actualization from a traumatic childhood would be sort of the basis, right? The basis with which other people could gravitate to, this is just one example, could gravitate to, wow, I went through something like that, or I know someone who went through like that, or I'm in charge of an NGO where we take care of trauma survivors, and they might be able to identify themselves as a new person with a new identity in contrast from who they used to be or who they were in the past. I mean, there's infinitely many different theoretical developments that you can have. It doesn't have to be impersonal, institutional, international, abstracted, sort of ideological blah, blah, blah. That's the stuff I'm interested in personally. If you're interested in interpersonal stuff, then you can talk about theoretical development as intrapersonal. That manifests itself in its greatest force in terms of self-actualization. Self-actualization is obviously theoretical. Its application manifests itself in something that's observable, tangible, empirically verifiable. I'm no longer that other person. Look what I've done. Look who I've become as a consequence of any number of things. So general knowledge, very still, based in, and I'll talk about particular knowledge in a second. Number 3, knowledge of, right? This is my sort of contribution. Very, nothing deep here. But a general knowledge is a knowledge of. You have an understanding of the functioning of something, sort of how knowledge, right? How, right? You have a knowledge of stuff. I could explain how this thing works because I have a knowledge of this thing. I don't mean to sort of trivialize the importance of knowledge of, because how is what most of the scientific and engineering community is built on. History is built on knowledge why. Knowledge of with respect to why. Knowledge of with respect to how, sort of process-based knowledge. Explain to me how this thing works. if I can explain how this thing works, I have a knowledge of this thing. Part of that thing being its functioning. So it's important to recognize that that knowledge would require, that knowledge of would require that you have an understanding how. Right? The knowledge of the thing would require that you have an understanding of how the thing functions. In terms of object knowledge, it can be totalized. You can have a total understanding of an object. The object was designed to perform function X. This thing initiates this, this relates to that, and thus you can have a total understanding of objective knowledge. Subjective knowledge can only approximate total understanding. You can never, ever, ever, even theoretically, arrive at total understanding of, knowledge of, subjective. It can never happen. Not even the subject, him or herself. I myself cannot even have a complete understanding of myself. I cannot have total knowledge of myself because I am not an object in sort of the vulgar materialist sense. Of course, I am sort of biologically determined. There's no question about that. But our spatio-temporal perceptive blah 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 is such that interpretation, as informed by the event, transforms perpetually how I see the world. And thus, as time passes, my interpretations pass, and as my interpretations change, I change. Who I am in the world, changes. Thus, it's not fixed like sort of the objective world. It is forever evolving, manifesting, transforming itself, or devolving. That necessitates a transformation in our knowledge. Thus, self-actualization is, unlike, I reject this point in Maslow, that self-knowledge is itself. I'm more deconstructivist in this approach, so I categorically disagree with Maslow on sort of the way in which it's articulated that self-actualization is a fixed state of affair. I believe that you can actualize self, and that actualization can evolve further, sort of uber. I believe it could devolve into a more debased actualization, and that the idea of self-actualization as being a definitive fixed point at which I can say I have arrived never actually attains. You never actually attain self-actualization because the attainment of whatever it was collapses in its attainment. I want to become the professor. I'm the professor. I no longer want to become. I'm no longer in a state of becoming. I'm in a state of being. And I'm not going to get into the sort of philosophical bits. And it's not sort of Mickey Mouse. It's, no offense to Mickey. Mickey's the man. But it was a failure on sort of Maslow's account to make the being-becoming distinction clear. Right? They are not the same thing. So that actualization is being, but being necessitates new becoming. You don't have a state of fixed being, ever. Not as materialized bodies, maybe theoretically, but that's some other blah, blah, blah. Alright, 1D, the application is good qualitative analysis would seek to understand the process wherein, for example, experts attained holistic understanding. The expert can only ever, I keep erasing the stuff that I want to refer to. Remember when I had the gear there? The expert only ever attains holistic understanding of objective functionings. Right? This would be the analysis of someone who is in science. The qualitative analysis of someone who does not deal in qualitative studies, but who does hard scientific research. Right? There's enormous amount of growth potential in qualitative methodological research, wherein practitioners, qualitative researchers, interview quote-unquote hard scientists, not about the scientific facts, but about their perception of the world and how their perception of the world informed their scientific discoveries. I mean, I would love to hear a book of, living hard scientists and sort of a narrativized account as to how they discovered the big things that they discovered. It would be probably the most mundane crap ever. I would imagine. I was at the beach and I saw the tide come in, and then I thought, oh wow, I was at the park and I was swinging my daughter, and I thought about sort of this fact, and it's like Newton and the apple fell. I know this is all cliched. The apple fell, and I came up with I discovered the gravitational constant. I mean, I know that's laughable. But the narrativized story of their perceptions of the world, and how their perceptions of what people might overlook, the mundane aspects of our daily lives, the mundane aspects of our daily perception, led to enormous scientific discoveries that motivated and propagated enormous scientific achievement as an objective fact. It is holistic. It is holistic. It's potentially holistic. I can explain the motivation that led me to the discovery. I can talk about the scientific method in which the scientific discovery became reproducible. The reproducibility as the condition in which it's verified. I can talk about how that reproducibility led to any type of product-based blah blah blah. You can track the entire process from beginning and its inception to the end in terms of production. You can't do that with respect to wholly qualitative methodologies. Why? Because subjective identity is always evolving, always devolving, always transforming, always in a state of flux. I think qualitative researchers should recognize that we, as qualitative researchers, are not relegated to interviewing people who are going to explain those aspects of their lives which are wholly interpretational. We do have an opportunity to interview, as I just said, those members of our social community who are motivated, not necessarily by God. I mean, you could interview people who have theistic belief, but interview those aspects, those individuals in our community who are motivated by the community itself, by the world itself, by biology itself, by the stuff, the materiality surrounding us, derive motivation from the banal observation of the objective world and transform the objective world because of that perception. How do you perceive the world in that way? Why? Because I want to try to see the world the way you see it. I want to try and have a perception of the world the way in which you have it. I might not be inclined to make the scientific discoveries that you have, but what a cool way to look at the world, right? Huge room for a more holistic understanding of our ability intellectually. Now, of course, this is all general, and not everything that I said was very sort of grandiose, macro level. We weren't talking about specifics and particularities. We weren't talking about specialized, itemized knowledge, the stuff that I love the most. Very, very dense analysis of something that's very, very refined and nuanced. That is particular knowledge. In terms of particular knowledge, it is the to be familiar with. It is a branch of knowledge that is specific to a discipline. So, for example, philosophy is the umbrella. Ethics is a branch. Moral ethics is, or feminist ethics is a subdivision of ethics, which is a subdivision of philosophy. But feminist ethics has its own subdivision, which would be sort of feminist epistemic ethics, sort of the epistemology of feminist ethics. Very, very specific. I actually have a student who might be working on the epistemology of feminist ethics. She's a very, very, very astute student. And it was via conversations with her that I recognized, hey, that's what you're really doing, right? You're really interested in sort of the epistemology of feminist ethics, which is so subdivided. It's so specific. It's so refined that the more refined knowledge becomes, the more particular knowledge becomes, the more you have an opportunity, just from a straight marketing standpoint, to sell yourself as an academic, right? Why do you just want to be a philosopher? There's a million philosophers. Why don't you become a specialist, right? You will find some aspect of the overarching umbrella and reduce that overarching umbrella to its specializations, and then you can make meaningful contributions once you arrive at lacuna and blah, blah, blah. I talked about this earlier, such that you fortify that specialization by contributing new interpretive models to that individual aspect. That's knowledge, that's qualitative methods research, or research in general at its finest. at its finest. So that you would imagine, in hard science, you would imagine a geneticist isn't just talking about cloning or this, but sort of the micro level at which, you know, protein manipulation facilitates this individual specific act of blah, 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 right? Uber specific. The idea is academia tends towards specialization. Once you get to this level, and you assume this responsibility and this obligation, it's almost impossible, if you're doing your job right, to remain general. There are general, quote-unquote, practitioners, but overwhelmingly, any number of educational disciplines, they are fortified by the specialization and the specialized interests of individual PhDs, individual researchers. For me, I tend to have a very niche-specific job function, which is the identification of specializations without mastery in specializations. What I do is I just, hey, don't you know that this is a new field for study? Hey, go write a book on it. Hey, don't you see I've helped you find a new potential niche for specialization? I'm not interested in writing it. Why don't you write about it? Here's another one. Reduce this, reduce this. Don't you see how this new potential specialization is justified based on everything that I said? This whole video lecture is me pumping out new possibilities for specialization. If you're watching, it's impossible for you to watch this whole series and not get an idea of contributions, novel contributions that can be made. It might not be the exact examples that I'm using, but the examples that I'm using are a consequence of my understanding of the theoretical narratives that fortify sort of the framework, and it's up to you to find out what I'm saying, find in what I'm saying your interests, and specialize. Right? So, analogous with Aristotle's techne, not going to get into that, this is a skill craft-based knowledge. It is a knowledge, and here's a direct quote, the episteme is not a form of knowledge or a type of rationality. It is knowledge in, not knowledge of. I have a knowledge in this very specific, I have a knowledge, and remember, this is almost deconstructivist, so could you make distinctions between knowledge in and knowledge of? It's arbitrary for the most part, so don't obsess about the distinctiveness. The grand distinction of is knowledge of, the general feel is a knowledge of systemic functioning, macro level, general articulation, broad knowledge. Knowledge in is a specialized knowledge, a knowledge of something very, very specific. So you can imagine that some person has a knowledge, you're a mechanic, and you have a knowledge of sort of each bit of the general mechanisms of cars and what each part does. The carburetor does this, the gas valves and intake system does this, fuel injection does that, all of this does that. But then you have a very specific sort of expertise in sort of the way nitrous oxide sort of does this with respect to this new, microchipped infused blah blah blah. You get the idea. Very, very particular knowledge, very, very specialized knowledge. And as you find yourself matriculating through your graduate experience, through your graduate coursework, as a consequence of the conferral of a PhD in any university anywhere in the United States of America, probably even the world, is that you're going to have specialization. I can't tell you, I think every single graduate student I've ever had a conversation with, ever, has been, what do you want you to write your dissertation on initially? Very macro level, very big, very huge. And my job function as a mentor is to help the student specialize. That's too general, that's way too broad. That's too specific. That's less broad. Now you're starting to sound like, okay, that's specific. Okay, that's a good topic. Okay, let's find literature to justify because it's a little too specific. Do you have enough? Is there enough there? Oh wow, you found literature? Wow, yeah, you can actually justify some of these stuff with appeal to literature. Is there anything that hasn't been discussed yet? There's some idea that hasn't been discussed in all the literature? Put your name on it. That's you. They put their name on it, they give me a shout out, everybody's happy. 2D, qualitative application. Specialized knowledge typically yields increased specialization. Power reproduces itself in power. Practice becomes the condition with which discursive opportunities arise, but the very condition for discussion creates and reifies power. Similarly, specialization creates new modes of specializing. This is why we can talk about the possible likelihood of a sort of sex with robots, sex with your androids. We wouldn't even be able to talk about that if people didn't specialize circuitry. And then people didn't take that specialization of circuitry and try to map the human brain. And that in the process of neurocognitive mapping of the human brain, we recognize that we can take sort of that electrical basis with which the brain functions and potentially reproduce that artificially. But if we reproduce that neurocognitive and more neuroelectrical functioning of the human brain artificially, we could potentially create artificial life. And if we create that artificial life form and put it in a real doll body, then we could potentially have sex with this new life, and thus, and thus it's very weird. It gets weird. But what's weird today will be normal tomorrow, right? It was weird to talk about Pascal's discovery, which disproved spontaneous generation. It was weird to talk about microbial life. It was, imagine living in a world in which microbes, the conception of the microbes didn't even exist. Human longevity is a complete, the Human Longevity Project is a complete, it's all a consequence, or almost all a consequence of the discovery of microbes. Can you imagine how bizarre it must have been talking about there's invisible stuff in the air that's making you sick, and that stuff is contributing to dysentery and plague, and we can think about killing invisible things. Think about how ridiculous this sounds. We can kill invisible things and prolong our life. That sounds like, that's beyond magic. That sounds like nonsense. We're going to kill invisible things, and killing invisible things is going to make us live longer. And that is the truth. Killing invisible things make us live longer. So you better believe having sex with non-human synthetically created objects sounds really bizarre, but, you know, given enough time, it'll be like, oh, what are you talking about? Yeah, having sex with Oh, Jason, you're publishing this for the world to see. It's perverted as hell. But, you know, I want it to be weird. Because there's no, that's weird, but there's nothing weirder than killing invisible things so that you can live longer. And in fact, human longevity is absolutely indebted to killing invisible things so that we can live longer. Invisible as in macroscopic, not microscopic, right? So it can get as weird as you want it to be. So bottom of page 14, specialized knowledge typically yields increased specialization via contribution to the scientific social fields of research, and the conditions for contributions are a good topic for qualitative analysis, right? Sort of self-explanatory. So Marx's dual account for power, the only reason I want to, those of you who've been watching a lot of my series, you know I always am averse to sort of reference to Marx because there's so many quote-unquote Marxists. Unfortunately, when I talk to these Marxists, I can tell they've never read much of Marx aside from maybe the cliff notes to Marx, not to disrespect the people that I speak with, but everybody's a Marxist, everybody makes appeals to Marx, thus really nobody's a Marxist, nobody really makes appeals to Marx. Including me in this really trite section. So this is an egregious generalization of Marx, but I did feel responsibility to make sure that I incorporate it, and I'm apologizing ahead of time that the context of this appeal is itself an enormous generalization. If you want more, use this to supplement your search for more. So, direct quote, judicial power is understood as a right, a commodity, and something that is transferable. Judicial power, the power to judge, the power to condemn, the power to punish, the power to pathologize, especially in terms of sort of the psychological community. So you don't just think of political judicial power. The thou shalt and the thou shalt not in Nietzsche, for those of you who know about this power. The power to enact social norms that chastise and rebuke that level of power, and the ability to do so. What does it do? It becomes commodifiable. It becomes transferable. What you end up having in terms of power is, C-O-M, condemn, C-O-N. You end up having condemnation, which is via Nietzsche, it's the thou shalt not. So that you have the individual subject and the institution that condemns. We don't like what you're doing, so zap. We don't like what you're doing, so slap. We don't like what you're doing, so you're fired. We don't like what you're doing, so no this, no that. And everybody is scurrying to appease institutions of power. Why? Because institutions of power have judicial power to sort of slap you on the wrist. The idea is, however, the manifestation of judicial power always, and this is key, this is why Marx believes, I don't want to get technical, but this is why Marx believes capital, I disagree with him on this point, he believes capital will implode eventually because of these inherently exploitative propensity. If you have the dog collar, the electrical collar on the dog, and you have the zapper button, it becomes second nature to just zap whenever you want, not recognizing that you're zapping the dog, not recognizing that the dog's eventually going to get tired of you zapping, and it is because of an inability to regulate that judicial power, and this manifests itself the worst in a fascist state. It's that inability to regulate judicial power that is the most effective means of usurping power, right? If you want to topple a regime, Chomsky does this really well. You just talk about itemized instances of abuses of power. And they did this, and they did this, and they did this, and look, historical, don't take my word for it, they did this, and they did this, and they tortured these people, they killed these people, they gassed these people, they murdered these people, they did this, they poisoned these people, they did this, an itinerary list of everything, and get the population mobilized in opposition to the abuses of judicial power. That is the most effective means of toppling power. Because there comes a point at which it is that inclination to just keep zapping that collapses belief. It collapses affinity, allegiance. And once loyalty is lost, it can never be recovered, right? Now, the idea is a recognition that, like me, my effort is, hey, you're doing this, you can imagine, and you could compromise what you have if proper attention isn't paid to those who are constantly saying, hey, abuses of power will undermine your power, and that's being overlooked so that you can establish judicial power. Well, if things topple, those of us who said, hey, I'm not going to be like everybody else and just do the itinerary list of all the things that you're doing bad, but rather transcend that, I think, and say, hey, don't you see that if you continue doing this, you will lose your power, and you lose your power? Well, I did my bit. I did my bit. So that the idea in terms of the transference of power, via any number of things, power transference can be bequeathed. You can imagine that you are deemed one of us, if you will. We appreciate your contributions, and thus it's sort of the knightship, which is, I love that sort of symbolism, right? I love the symbolism of knightship because for me it's the greatest, and this is a little probably too personal, but it's the greatest symbolization of the transference, the willing transference of power, by saying, you were nobody before, and we're going to make you a knight, sort of in Arthurian times. But it's not just the making of the knight, it's that the knight bows, prostrates before the figurehead, who is the repository of power, and what the figurehead is doing is transferring power. So knighthood, in all of its symbolic blah blah blah, is a good justification of power transference. Obviously, the other mode is, usurpation of power, and that is inherently sort of problematic. It inherently yields destruction of human life and conflict and such. So that merit-based would be sort of the knight conferral of power, right? And I don't mean being knighted really, as much as I'm wanting to generate ghetto philosophy. The symbolism of the importance of knighthood in the transference of power in a way that acknowledges the dedication of the knight and the power of that individual in conferring knighthood. Similarly, this is why when you go to graduate your PhD, the student bows, curtsies a bit, and the professor hoods. What the professor is doing in hooding the candidate is saying, by the power vested in me, I transfer my authority to you, right? But the way you get that transference of power, you got to bend a little bit. So I love that. I mean, that to me is the best of power, because it's organic. It's good for both parties. There's an acknowledgement of contribution. Of course, the person's going to feel good. I'm a knight now, and of course, the ability to create knights reinforces existing power and loyalty and allegiance. But it's, when you got the cronyism and the nepotism and the abuse of power, that people are like, no, forget this, right? And they don't want to be conferred. They don't want to be acknowledged. And if people lose that desire, lose that belief, you've lost everything. Because there's nothing you have that, as a matter of fact, for you to knight me or for you to confer that power to me would be to corrupt myself, because that would be part of that abusive practice. That's when you lost. That's when you've lost everything. That's when you've lost everything. Obviously, economic power, a possession that is used for domination in relations of power and class. Obviously, this is interpretive. Economic power is almost always articulated within the systemic abuses of capital as a means of protecting and safeguarding existing power, which manifests really in a non-abstract sense in multinational corporations, right? Which manifests itself in terms of, it's not even conspiracy theory, but sort of the International Monetary Fund and the regulation of money's financial markets. There are legitimate discourses on the exploitative capacities, and read any popular liberal scholar, and they've published infinite amounts of research on this. All of which, or most of which, is indebted to Marx's sort of critique. In fairness, however, because I'd like to be objective, I don't like to be objective, I am objective. In fairness, however, you can also look at the benefits. Not to say that benefits aren't themselves achieved as a consequence, sometimes, of exploitation, but you look at the benefits to India, it's growing middle class. The benefits to Brazil, it's growing middle class. The benefits to China, it's growing middle class. All a consequence of the ideological structure inherent in sort of market economies and blah, blah, blah. It's not to say that it does away with the bad exploitative bit, but the idea is, let's not just be one-sided and tell the story of the exploitation. Let's remember that, yes, there are exploitative elements, and we need to talk about that. But there are also, to be fair, beneficial elements, and very few people tell that narrative. If you're interested in qualitative methodologies that don't have anything to do with participant research, but you want to sort of do theoretical content analysis, to be fair, why not do something new? Don't jump on the bandwagon and do what's easy, which is an atomization of sort of the exploitative elements of capital. Why not try and talk about the good things that capital does do? If you don't believe capital does these good things, then don't listen to what I'm saying. But if you believe, no, capital is a vehicle, is a force for social good, and I want to write a dissertation that articulates how, a knowledge of this, how capital can be used and operationalized internationally for social transformations, for social good, that would be a great dissertation. It would be a great contribution. And also, since there's so many people who dispute that point, you would immediately have a good sort of, a good discursive ground, because the worst thing is to publish something and nobody cares. It's better to publish something and everybody disagree with you, because at least you're getting sort of reference in a sort of egoistic sense, than to publish something and everybody's like sort of indifferent to your work. Since such a huge community is anti-capital, if you write anything defending capital or defending the potential benefits inherent in capital, oh my goodness, you're going to have immediate, it's immediate fuel for the fire, which means that people are referencing your work and people are thinking about your work and people have to deal with the content of your work. I haven't the time nor the inclination to write that. I have other things that I'm interested in, other things that I'm doing, but I throw that out there for those of you who might be as yet another. I mean, it's infinite examples that I've given now. But there's yet another example of a good, viable, qualitative methodology that one of you might be interested in doing. So, assumptions pertaining to domination. One, that power can be overthrown, right? The fact that there is a genuine ontology for liberation. Some people believe there is a genuine ontology for liberation. Some people deny. What's your position? Do you want to take a Freirean account in which liberation can actualize itself in equity globally? Or do you want to take a more Spivakian approach, a more Foucauldian approach, in which liberation is always approximated, but it is never attained? Thus, the process and the fight for liberation is the real social transformation. It's always a process of seeking to overthrow systems of abuse and structures of power, recognizing that the final overthrow will never occur. Or is it that? Or is it something in between? Another assumption, the absolute liberty, freedom is probable, right? Sort of entailed in what I just said. And number three, that domination can be overcome, that is, in the collapse of capital. And I've already discussed sort of all of that. So the idea is liberation is ontologically real, liberation is socially realizable, but fundamentally it devolves into a new fight for liberation. Those who were oppressed become oppressors, those who were oppressors become oppressed. Party lines change, ethnical lines change, identities change, but the structure and the foundational basis for continual hostilities is, if there is a human nature, it's that, unfortunately. So Foucault establishes his account of power by directly challenging the assumptions about the possessiveness, the materialistic nature of power, which would necessitate its overcoming. This idea is power is in everything. Power is absolute. Power is systemic. And the idea that you could overthrow power is a failure to really conceptualize what power is. Power is everything. Power is everything and is in everything. Power is in the the inanimate world and the animate world. And the relationship between the inanimate world and the animate world is itself defined by power. Power and power relation is absolute. Of course, this is a huge generalization. There's so much that goes into that. The idea, as I said, is to make a recognition, and I think, again, just to say this point a second time, the relationship between interpersonal, international, interorganizational relations. Qualitative accounts for overwhelmingly the vast majority of qualitative methodologies. Probably 99.99. I think there needs to be a recognition that we need to start to talk about the likeliness and the likelihood that we're going to be having a lot more animate, inanimate human relations in terms of our relations with our software programs and our computers, our relations with synthetic products and such, that we're going to need to identify social theoretical frameworks with which we can offer a foundation for new psychological analyses and new psychiatric analyses, new regulatory policy-based initiatives. All of these are generated from social scientific research, the research that we do, and thus we can make huge contributions to ethics, to policy, to psychology and psychiatry, to a growing understanding of our anthropological transformations and transformations in culture by a recognition that we are changing who we are as a species insofar as our interaction with other people are now contextualized within interactions with non-biological stuff and the importance that that has. I need some water, excuse me. So this is an important point. The essential practical consequences of the principle of power as law, namely the fact that there is no escaping from power, that it is always already present, constituting that very thing which one attempts to counter it. Where there is power, there is resistance. This resistance is never This resistance is never in a position of exteriority in relation to power. That within power, power resists itself. Power resists itself. It creates conditions for its own resistance. That we don't think of resistance as power, resistance to power. No, it's power, and within the structure of power. Actually, it'd be like this. Within the structure of power is a resistance. It is perpetually creating conditions for resistance, but those conditions for resistance are not exterior to power, such that if you think of, for example, idea that comes immediately to mind, national security affairs and the Snowden fiasco or Assad fiasco within the national security architecture, within the architecture of surveillance technologies and nations and surveillance technologies and national security, there is resistance from within the national security. It's not an external social pressure. As a matter of fact, I think the external social pressure is less than the internal pressure, because those inside really understand what's going on, and this is where Snowden comes from, and this is where Assad comes from, because they're saying, if you only knew what this technology really does and is capable of doing, and there's an internal force. Sort of, if you have that ghetto philosophy understanding of resistance from within, think about generalizing that now to a meta analysis of power. There is no exteriority to power. It's not even proper to draw these lines. There is no boundary to power. Power is sort of the invisible force, and resistance is inherent to structures of power. So anytime you have power, you're going to have resistance. Anytime you have an instructor, you're going to have the student who disagrees with me. You're going to have other faculty members and colleagues who disagree with me. Anytime you have institutions of power that confer sort of what ought to be the case, judicial power in terms of the ability to condemn and condone, you're going to have those who refuse to be condemned, those who refuse to be punished, especially if they know they have done nothing wrong and such. And this is the nature of power, and it's good ground for qualitative analysis. So the application is, in relation to the aforementioned quote, the transference of power between victims and victimizers, where former victims become victimizers, is a perfect example about transformation. Is a perfect example is a perfect example that shows us that the inevitability of liberation as such is in itself, implausible. It's not impossible, but it's implausible. And individuals in their dialectical relationship will preserve resistance to structures of power. So if I'm in power, I'm going to want to protect it from those who resist my power. And if I lose power, I'm going to seek to regain it by those who usurped it. And this is the habitual cycle. So I want to check my technology to make sure I have enough battery and I have enough time for this last page, page 16, for section 1.6, before I go to section 1.5, before I go to 1.6. So I'm going to pause here, make some assessments, and then come back. Okay, so I want to continue with the discussion on the top of page 16. So we're going to look at two forms of power. So let's shift our focus to that content. Okay, so top of page 16, two forms of power. And as we'll see, relational power, structural power. As we'll see, one, we talked already about the relational aspect of power. I think right at the beginning of this section. Where was it? Let me see if I can find it. On page 13, the very first point, power is relational. And what we're going to do is we're going to look more into, if you just want to sort of cross-reference this, bottom of page 13, beginning of section 1.5, we talked about the relational aspect of power. And I went into a description of what that relational aspect is. We talked about the dialectical, we talked about different relationships that individuals have, communities and collective organizations have, mentor-mentee, teacher-student, master-slave, and such. So I want to explain a little bit more. The chain, quote-unquote, and I'll explain this in a second, challenges the assumption that power totalizes in its alleged duality. Right? The chain challenges the assumption that power totalizes in its alleged duality, that is, oppressed, oppressor, hegemonic, heterodox, etc., which generalizes, formalized a network with variable degrees of oppression and resistance. So that the idea is, in terms of relational power, sort of the seminal account of relational power is one of a polemic, right? So you have a pole, you have an opposing pole, you have the tension between the two, right? And this would be resistance. And it's not to say that relational power doesn't manifest like this. It is, in fact, the case that relational power does manifest in terms of a polemical relationship, right? One opposition to another, some binary state in which, power is being challenged and power is being augmented and transformed and such. The idea is to recognize, after what we just said only a few minutes ago, with respect to resistance, resistance is internal to power, right? I just had this picture up. Resistance is internal to power. It's not that resistance is understood as an exteriority. We, in our analysis of power, especially political power, tend to see resistance manifest itself in terms of social activism or social movements. We see it manifest in terms of riots. We see it manifest in terms of revolutions. And the revolt and the riot and social activism is external to the political body for which it is fighting for recognition or fighting it liberation. So we assume that resistance is something external because all of our historical references, our political references, it intimates that, right? It suggests that that's how resistance manifests, as an exteriority. The truth of the matter is that power, as we've seen, and I'm not going to go back and do an entire deconstruction of the analysis, but power, as we've seen, power knowledge specifically, posits the condition in which we can talk about social practice. And social practice lends itself to discussion. It's discursive. It lends itself to a discursive space. And that discursive space transforms power yet again. It reifies, reinforces power yet again. Oh, you ought to do that. Oh, no, you ought not to do that. My culture says this. My culture says that. And on. So that the idea is that resistance is everywhere. It's not an exteriority to power. Insofar as we have power, we have resistance to power. So the two are inextricably bound, resistance and power. Where there is power, there will be resistance. Where there's resistance, there is power, obviously. So that the idea is, this polemic works, but the polemic trivializes the genuine complexity of this power relation. And, as I said here, the chain challenges the assumption of the duality. So this would be an explanation of the duality. And I would say that it's not mutually exclusive. It's not either there is a sort of a network, power network, or there are nodalities, or there is simply a duality of power. No, it's a little bit of both. It depends on how you're assessing it. In terms of the chain, you can imagine that rather than it being a polemic, there are some degrees of associations that link one aspect, one link in the chain, to some other aspect in the chain. The idea is, in terms of talking about oppressor, oppressed, those in power, the hegemonic force, those who are opposed or marginalized by hegemonic force, this generalizes, we can talk about various degrees of oppression and resistance, right? So that in order to make an understanding completely of a power network, if you will, a chain of command, we have to recognize that that chain of command is built to facilitate some institutional end, right? That chain, and now we can obviously use sort of any hierarchical structure, education, military, most business communities. You know, you have a hierarchy, and this would probably be set vertical. The entire institution is the composite of individually linked parts. Well, those individually linked parts are hierarchically organized, so it probably would be better to have drawn this vertically. It doesn't really matter. And the point is, in terms of assessing the dynamics of power and the dynamical relationship of power, one thing that you can, I mean, there's any number of things, but one thing that comes to mind that you can do is the assessment of sort of educational goals in K through 12 education with respect to, rather than a dynamic duality where you have one force against another force. In education, it really isn't that. It's not just the teacher versus the student or the teacher aiding the students. No, the idea is you have a teacher and a diverse group of students, all with different needs, some with special needs. And the teacher has to be able to flexibly acclimate him or herself to any number of, personal variables, right? Distinctions in personality, distinctions in learning types and such. And irrespective of the diversity of the class, this teacher still has curriculum that he or she needs to facilitate. So you can imagine that the challenge for the individual instructor is the facilitation of one curriculum, right, which unifies the purpose of the entire classroom, so that the curriculum unifies the relationship, it binds the relationship between the teacher and any number of students. But despite the fact that it's one curriculum, one teacher, there's various degrees of sort of learning acumen among the student body. One qualitative research analysis that might help, and I've read just a little bit, I'm not an educational theorist proper, that might help to implement and to flesh out this sort of associational link rather than a duality, is peer education, peer teaching. So just like in, I'm sort of dating myself now because I know this technology is probably, not as, as meaningful as it used to be. I really don't know. I'm not on the internet in that capacity much anymore. But they used to have, and they probably still do have peer-to-peer technology. So, network, Napster. Napster came along, and you would upload your recipes for the fruitcake for Christmas, of course, wink wink, and someone else would, download your recipe and upload, something else, and you get the idea. Like, peers were exchanging informational content via this network. In terms of educational theory, the network is the curriculum, right? The network is, and remember, we're talking about power networks, right? And so I really mean this, right? The thing that unifies all participants in this game is the curriculum. The teacher adheres to the curriculum, the students learn from the curriculum. So the curriculum becomes the substrate. Peer-to-peer education is the idea that the smarter students, not that they receive the obligation of the teacher, but the smarter students are paired with students who have a little bit more difficulty grasping the concept. And through this peer-to-peer pairing, say that 10 times fast, right? Through this peer-to-peer peering, which would manifest itself in sort of proximity, right? So that you can imagine that two people would sit at a bench, or two people would sit at some custom designed table in which, the smart kid is with the kid who's challenged by the content. Teacher disseminates the information to the class as a whole. The smart kids pick it up immediately, and they are encouraged to talk in class. And they help, and this can be taxing at times, and I understand, and granted, I said, I'm not an educational specialist, I don't know about behavioral sort of blah, 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 but you get the idea, right? The idea isn't just the teacher and the students, it's the teacher and a network of associations built between the students that facilitate curriculum development, right? So that the teacher and the students are all working towards the same end. The end is understanding and implementation of the curriculum. The teacher doesn't assume whole responsibility for curriculum implementation. The teacher, he or she, is facilitated, the implementation of the curriculum is facilitated by peer-to-peer education. And, I think, I don't know enough about educational reform to speak on the topic. I really don't. I overheard it. My wife's an educator, and either we were talking or I read something where this popped up, and I was like, I'm gonna, a couple months later when I'm doing this, or whenever I need to, pull from my database of just random facts, I'll be able to incorporate it. This is one of those random facts that now I have an opportunity to incorporate. So you get the idea, right? It's not teacher, student, traditional banking concept. It's not me, them, us, you. It is, one, we have found the network, we have found the structure that binds everyone in this sort of forum. We have identified distinct roles. These roles can be as diverse as there are people, or as diverse as, as diverse as infinity, at least theoretically. And the way in which, in the example of curriculum implementation, it is implemented is through the diversification of pedagogy. Teacher teaches, peer-to-peer. I guess there's Q&A. If one of the smarter kids don't quite understand, the teacher comes and facilitates a little bit. But from what I understand, this is a potentially effective model, and it could be implementable K through 12 to help, advance our educational base. Again, I don't know. I haven't looked at the numbers. I don't know, and nor will I. I don't know the facts of this. I haven't seen any tests per se. But I just wanted to give you an example how we can transform sort of traditional educational conceptualization to a more holistic understanding, right? This relational force that isn't just a dialectical binary. We can look at it in terms of sort of causal links and associational nexus. Okay, so that should be clear. Number two, structural power. Structural power is based in discipline and the establishment of rules of conduct, morals, etiquette. Right? Structural power is based in discipline and the establishment of rules of conduct, morals, and etiquette. It creates moral communities. Structural power creates a moral community, and this is important. If we're talking about morality, if we're talking about, so this is number two, this is structural power. I'm running out of ink. This is structural power. The idea is it's based in conduct, morals, etiquette. I'm not going to spend the time to sort of make demarcations between conduct, morals, and etiquette. They're very nuanced demarcations, but it's however you interpret it. The distinction between these three terms is completely fine with me. But the idea is that the point of structural power, the impetus for the establishment of structural power is the manifestation of these criteria: etiquette, morals, conduct. So structural power then creates these forces, right? Morality is a force. Conduct is a force. Not necessarily in a pejorative sort of antagonistic sense. Etiquette is a force, which obviously modifies human behavior, right? We have expectations. Whoever we is, it's probably hegemonic, but we have expectations about conduct. We have expectations about intercommunal relationships. You cannot have political establishment. You can't have sort of functioning society. And to be honest with you, I was listening to this just now today on NPR. Surprisingly enough, you can't have business. You can't have capital where you don't have conduct. There's a destabilized, unsafe environment, right? If the environment is unsafe and things are uncertain, businesses flee like the plague. You need regularity. You need some basis of expected collective behavior in order for capital to flourish. If people are, vigilante justice and there's riots in the streets everywhere, no one's going to go out and go shopping. I hate to say it like that, but there are reasons, right? And I'm not going to sort of get into all of that. But the idea is there are reasons, obviously, and just for good social interaction. You don't want to be threatened. You don't want to think that your life is in danger every time you step outside the house. It creates moral communities and exclusions via pathologizing human behavior. I sort of jumped the gun with pathologizing human behavior, so before I get to that, these, we'll say modes, all three of them, of behavioral, B-E-H-A-V-I-O. These, I hate to say control, so I'll put regulation. These modes of behavioral regulation, be they etiquette, morality, conduct, all established by structural power. these modes of behavioral regulation sort of consolidate those three terms into just this one concept, behavioral regulation. These modes of behavioral regulation, some say are paternalistic, that's fine, no problem. It could be authoritarian or totalitarian or fascistic, okay, that's fine. They will be implemented via state power in any number of degrees. But the point of establishing these modalities is to consolidate the community based on how they behave. So you're going to have those who conform, and this is just a statistical fact, right? You're going to have those who conform to behavioral expectations, right? Those who conform to behavioral sort of regularity, expectations in behavior, and those who don't. The community, the vast community that conform to behavioral expectations are part of the social community, right? This is sort of like 101. So we have modes of behavioral regulations. These modes of behavioral regulations create behavioral expectations, macro level, right? So this would be BEHEXPECT. So these are behavioral expectations. So modes of behavioral regulation create behavioral expectations. Those behavioral expectations are going to create one of two states with maybe a few exceptions. But the truth of the matter is it's one of two sort of things that are going to arise. Those who conform to the behavioral expectations. So this is population who conform. Pop who conform. Right? And the population, the overwhelming majority of people will conform. So the population of individuals who conform to behavioral expectations will be part of the social community. The social community will always be larger. Well, most likely. There are instances of revolution where it changes, but it's very rare that occurs. The overwhelming majority of the population who conform will be labeled the social community. And then there is always going to be a minority community, not in terms of race, not in terms of ethnicity or color or education or any of that, just a minority statistically, a statistically less significant portion of the population will not conform. So, pop who do not conform to behavioral expectations, and this will be the antisocial. Right? This will be members of the antisocial community. Members of the antisocial community as an inherent necessity of just the fact that you posit behavioral expectations. There's inevitably going to be those who, you can imagine, right? These are the drug dealers, these are the gangbangers, these are maybe prostitutes, these are, any number of, these are the white collar freaking embezzlers, I just wanted to think in terms of impoverishment, right? The cheaters and the scammers. There's going to be a smaller segment of the population who refuse to conform, and they're antisocial. To be technical, when we're talking about antisocial behavior, and I don't want to sort of deconstruct this too much, but just generally, when we're talking about antisocial behavior, we don't necessarily mean, it should not be conceptualized to mean as threatening other members of society in terms of harm. That's sort of obvious, but that really isn't the point. The point of antisocial behavior is that the behavior itself does not conform to the behavioral expectations used to regulate, right? Used to regulate social interaction. The fact that there is a refusal to conform to these expectations makes the behavior antisocial. So almost anything could, in theory, be antisocial because everything's socially constructed anyway. But the idea is antisocial behavior, it's a misnomer to think that antisocial behavior is the psychopath who goes out killing people, or, obviously that is. The gangbangers who, loot and rob and maim and kill, the drug dealers, that's obvious, right? Antisocial behavior also, to various degrees, or almost anything that you can think of that do not inherently conform to behavioral expectations. And we can sort of deconstruct that to various degrees. I'm not going to spend the time because you could do a whole semester's lecture on sort of the gradation of antisocial behavior. Those instances of a refusal to conform, for example, you'll see young kids, when I was coming up, to wear your hat backwards was like ridiculous. Like, you just don't wear your hat backwards. Now it looks completely laughable. It looks ridiculous now. But back then it was like, oh, he's trying to make a statement, he's wearing his hat backwards, right? Or you can imagine Madonna, I am dating myself, but this is the era I come from. Even bigger than just wearing your head backwards, Madonna really put it, the risque of all risques was underwear was supposed to be worn, obviously, underneath your clothing. And what Madonna decided to do, in sort of a crisscross moment, was to wear her underwear on the outside of her clothing. Now we look at it and we're like, wow, that's so obviously 80s. But you can imagine being in the 80s and seeing, women with lace on their hands and, maybe a bra on the outside of their shirt. What? No, that's not acceptable, right? That's not how we expect whoever we and our is, the hegemon, expect our young women and girls to conduct themselves socially, and thus those who refused to conform created an anti-social, if you will, movement. So it doesn't, wearing your bra on the outside of your shirt isn't, you're not going to get arrested for that. It's not an offense or attack on society, but that refusal to conform is actually antisocial. It is an antisocial act. And this, it might be a little too niche specific. This is uber specialized stuff, but it might make a good, I can imagine sort of like a pop philosophy or pop poli-sci book. This is the type of stuff I like writing and I like reading, where it's serious academic analysis, but it's applied to things that are more pop culture driven. It would be interesting to look at antisocial behavior, the spectrum, or the segment of the spectrum of antisocial behavior that really no one would consider to be antisocial, right? And it's sort of tongue-in-cheek, a bit of wit, a bit of humor in the writing. I think that would just be genius. It would be an amazing publication, right? To think that, no, we're not talking about serial killers and psychopaths and murderers and drug dealers and prostitutes. We're talking about, young girls who wear, their lace on the outside. Oh my goodness, But look what ended up happening. It caused a transformation in society. And I'm not going to get into that, blah, blah, blah. But there's tons and tons and tons and tons of room for development. And I think this recognition that structural power is in place to enforce sort of etiquette and code and morality is one of the things that young people inherently rebel against. The funny thing is that this inherent rebellion, this inherent antisocial movement, usually within the young, ends up becoming the new social order, for the most part. And then there's a new generation to rebel against them, and all is well in the world, right? This is sort of the changing of the guard. The good stuff. All right. Now, in terms of pathologizing human behavior, now that we have that sort of, I wouldn't say it's ghetto philosophy. There's some true complexity in that. I went through it rather quickly. But now that we have an understanding of that, you can see how the Michel Foucault, to no surprise, everybody knows this. Anybody who knows anything about Michel Foucault you can sort of generalize his disdain. Might sound a little harsh, but you can sort of generalize his disdain in the world to one community, and it would be sort of psychiatry, right? He believed, that it was an institution to exploit the population. It was sort of the strong arm. It was the bully. The psychological community kept those who refused to conform or did not conform. Obviously, homosexuality was an act that homosexuality is a perfect example. You wouldn't think that homosexuality in the 50s, 60s, 70s and such was an antisocial act, or an antisocial community, or an antisocial movement, but it was. It was. It's now no longer antisocial. It's part of our society. It's integrated. The antisocial has become a marginalized community of the social, right? But it's definitely within homosexual LGBTI community is part of the social community. The idea is those within those institutions of power, structures of power, political force, religious force, educational force, forces, banking forces, probably with respect to homosexuality, I would say it was probably religious, maybe political to a lesser extent, and educational to a lesser extent. But I would say probably, and this is just me sort of off the top, of the four big forces of power. I mean, there are many more, but the main forces of power. I would imagine sort of the political and overwhelmingly the religious community exercised its force to make expectations in terms of behavioral conformity. It was immoral to be a homosexual. It's not necessarily a matter of etiquette. It's not really a matter of etiquette per se. It was definitely improper conduct, the homosexual act, improper conduct, the ways in which homosexual sex occurred, to evoke even the word is itself pejorative, right? The act is itself pejorative. It's almost devoid of love, right? So that you don't talk about lovemaking per se. You know, sodomy, right? Or you evoke some really harsh word, despite the fact that, you know, it's consensual sex among adults, you know, for either pleasure or love. The words that we use to describe homosexual sex is itself pejorative. Even the words, it's devoid of love. You don't think love when you say the words. I mean, I can just deconstruct that to no end. So what ends up happening is those expectations for behavior, those who conform in the psychological community inside, now have a means of pathologizing the antisocial. Right? There's a means of pathologizing antisocial community. Right? And as again, the antisocial community isn't just the community of deviants and murderers and psychopaths and sexual predators and fiends and crackheads, and you know, it's not that group, even though that group is part of it. Part of the pathologization, for example, of the homosexual community was a consequence of the community's antisocial nature. But the idea, and this is why I keep returning to this point. I know it might sound like I'm beating a dead horse, but it's important to recognize that the concept of the antisocial creates this misnomer where we make assumptions that to be antisocial is to be this villain. No, the antisocial are those who do not conform, and homosexual sex and homosexual couples did not conform to behavioral expectations, and thus the larger community pathologized and demonized. They dehumanized and depersonalized those individuals who did not conform. And this is what Foucault wants to address. He wants to address, first of all, the structure of power, so in terms of structural power. So now we have an understanding of the various modalities and parts and relations in structural power. But he also wants to identify, I don't have my red marker, hold on, let's see if I can find it. Nope, damn it, that would have been good. He also wants to really emphasize this part. What he wants to do is he wants to emphasize the way in which pathologization becomes a means of perpetually excluding members of the community, right? Obviously, if you pathologize an act, if you pathologize a practice, a social practice, then you perpetually keep that community, or those who commit those acts, or those who participate in this practice, from integration, from assimilation, from sort of participation in shared identity. You keep them outside. So that's important. In terms of structural power, too, another element, just a quick side note because it came to my mind. Another way in which you could manifest you could create a really good qualitative methodology, content analysis. This wouldn't have to do with participants. Would be to look at Michel Foucault and compare Foucault to Galtung. Johann Galtung's G-A-U-L-T, Galtung, T-U-N-G, I think. Galtung's structural violence, and structural violence isn't necessarily concerned with the pathologization, but the way in which power organizes itself in a means to perpetuate capital or any number of means, and as a consequence, violence isn't direct. It's not physical violence where you can identify people being hit and struck and killed and stuff like that. The truth of it's weird fact, and it's impossible to really quantify. But structural violence, and Galtung is right. He is right in this regard. I think this becomes overused quite a bit. He is right though. Structural violence kills way more people than direct violence, right? No matter how many tens of thousands of people, we're not talking about sort of anomalous instances like the Holocaust and such, right? General sort of a century, or maybe, well, not last century was brutal, which is partly the reason why I have a problem with Galtung, right? It's very exceptional, his analysis. But the idea, theoretically, is direct violence is easily quantifiable. You can see one person shoot another person and count the body of the dead, if you will. Structural violence, at least theoretically, could kill equally, if not more, people as a consequence of our way of life, as a consequence of the way in which we exist. And institutions of power are in place to not, me personally, lecturing on it is a bit difficult because, a lot of this isn't built on numbers as much as I think it should be. And if the implication is to transform the system, there needs to be something empirical here, right? So, even though I'm a theorist, I like my application to be rigorous. The idea is you could do a combination, a content analysis of Galton's structural violence with Michel Foucault's discourse on the pathologization of, any number of communities to understand a more complex articulation. You'd be able to describe a more complex articulation of systemic power and the abuses therein, right? So you have violence on the one hand, which Galton spends a lot of time on, but you also have pathologization on the other. So whether it's going to be systemic means in which individuals in the population are encouraged to smoke or to drink and thus die as a consequence of that, blah, 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 or teenagers are going to be, obviously have access to, any number of intoxicants or drugs and all the people that die as a consequence of that, or just day-to-day driving hazards. All of these things factor into, and it factors into the quote-unquote violence, the indirect violence that the population is exposed to, coupled with the indirect violence that the population is exposed to, and the pathologization of the antisocial community. So that the quote-unquote antisocial community has now two levels. They have, like the social community, exposure to structural violence, but unlike the social community, they have exposure to pathologization. Thus, you could argue, and I'm giving you a freaking gem here, I'm doing all the hard work, but you could, I think it would be cool to write this. Thus, you could argue that those of quote-unquote antisocial community experience both pathologization and structural violence, right? Which, it just shows the level of sort of oppression that members of this community experience. And, you can make any type of political policy-based reforms, blah, 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 blah. The idea is we've taken the theoretical and we made it applicable. We should understand each part. You should understand why this community experiences more social stressors than this community. You should be able to account for that and such. Granted, I didn't go into a full sort of analysis of Galton's discussion of structural violence, but I gave you the information. You can look up that analysis on your own time. So the way in which we can conceptualize power in its more insidious form is that of the panopticon. Sounds like a Decepticon. It would be awesome to create a Decepticon called panopticon, right? So you have the panopticon, and I've attached the image of the panopticon. And you have a central location, and there is 180 degrees of, I think it's 180 degrees of sort of cell blocks. Individual cells next to individual cells, stacked in rows, stacked in columns, all around. In terms of structural power, I'm going to read this and I'm going to explain it. Structural power, this is the bottom of page 16. Structural power manifests in the following metaphor. The panopticon. Think Tupac's All Eyes on Me. Only I would take Tupac and merge Tupac with Michel Foucault, but it's a good example, right? Think Tupac's song, All Eyes on Me, where the me is the authority that is the hegemon. All Eyes on Me isn't about the individual person in the cell, because obviously if I'm in a cell here, and there are walls and a cell gate in front of me, I can't see the guy, the prisoner to my left, to my right, above or below me. No. All I can see is the panopticon. All I can see is the sort of the central looking I don't know what you call the central piece. I think the panopticon is a whole structure. But I can't see the central, I guess, guard's tower, if you will. Right? I can't, all I can see is that. I can't see anybody next to me. But the guard's tower, now we invert our perception. If I'm in the guard's tower and I'm looking out, I can monitor every single cell. I can monitor everybody's action in every single cell. Now granted, times have changed. We put video cameras up, I would imagine, and all of that feeds into some repository. But in a foregone error, you can imagine that this structural design allowed those in the guard's tower to see everybody. Allowed everybody to see the guard's tower, and no one could see anyone else. Right? So everyone saw the guard's tower. The guard's tower saw everyone, and no one saw everybody else. And this is a structure for a really structural control, in a sense. Individuals, I mean, this is an old story. There's nothing new here, and this has been rehashed and recounted in fiction and in novels. Most dystopic narratives assume this form, where we are socially separated from others within society. There's Big Brother, and all of us know that there's Big Brother, and we're all watching Big Brother, and Big Brother's watching all of us, but none of us are paying attention to each other. And that's the idea, right? That's the idea. Granted, in terms of the penitentiary system, it's real. In terms of our social practice, it's metaphorical. But the idea is it's a good way in which to articulate the control that's established by this structure. Why? Because I don't know what's going on around me. All I do know is information about myself and information about the established system of structure, right? The political establishment, the religious establishment, the educational establishment, and such. In a contemporary world, it's less about the educational establishment per se. It's more political and religious, right? Those are the two huge, and banking, true. And I guess it's all there. It's all there, depending on who you are. Everything's there. But we're gazed on it. It's gazed on us, but we're not paying attention to each other. Okay. So we understand A, and then lastly B on page 16, and I think this is going to end section 1.5. Social construction of the subject and subjectivity as a consequence of diagnoses and pathologization. And the idea is, in terms of society and our social interaction, you can imagine that we're not just talking about antisocial behavior here. I mean, obviously we are. And we're not just talking about antisocial communities here. Of course we are. We're talking about antisocial people. We're talking about, eventually, imagine that we were to extract, I have to throw this out. Imagine that we were to extract an individual from this community and put this individual under the microscope, if you will, right? And now we have sort of the all-seeing eye looking at the individual, and the individual looking at the all-seeing eye via sort of the panopticon metaphor. The individual, the identity of the individual, right? The subjective identity of the individual is pathologized. So we're not just talking about the community, we're not just talking about the behavior, we're talking about the individual person. You are you know, Bob, Mary, are a pathological person. Now, times have radically changed, but you cannot account for, this also would make a great, and I'm sure that, I don't know if anyone's done this, so here's another idea, right? Another idea. I don't know why, well, no, I know why I'm sticking to sort of LGBTI stuff, because I know the way in which Foucault situated his analysis, so that's why I keep going back to the LGBTI community. It would be interesting to look at baby boomers who are retiring now, or who have already retired, who were from this generation, and not just the baby boomer generation as a whole, but those individuals within the baby boomer generation who had always been homosexuals, and to ask them about their narratives of, tell me about that. Tell me about, you know, not just how you existed or how you kept it quiet, but did you really feel that you were pathological? Did you feel that you were deviant? Did you feel that you were a bad person? I would imagine I don't know, it would be interesting to read this, it really would be interesting to read this, that at least some members, if not a lot of members of that sample set would say, yeah, I felt like an evil, bad, immoral person. I felt horrible. And then compare how they feel now, right? So that society and the transformation and the progress that we've had in society, despite the fact that I recognize that this is, the religious community, not to knock the religious community, I don't know, but may say that, oh, this act is still devious and, individuals in that community are still bad and we're never going to accept it, blah, 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 what have you. Now, from a secular standpoint, no. Society's changed, right? It's no longer a society that looks at members of this community as being antisocial because look how much good they've done. They, quote unquote, look how much good they've done for the greater good, right? We've had any number of social contributions that have benefited us all. And the idea is, how do you feel now? How do you feel now? And how might you feel 20 years from now? And I would imagine as we become, I wouldn't even imagine, it has to be the case, that as we become more socially inclusive rather than exclusive, there will always be limits. But as we become, especially with the LGBTI community, as we become more socially inclusive, I would imagine that the subjective identity becomes less and less and less. The feeling of sickness, the feeling of deviance, the feeling of guilt, the feeling of shame dissipates, as it should. Why? Because it's society finally accepting the community, right? And that social acceptance is huge. It's huge in identity formation, right? If you are rejected continually by society, you're left to think, well, what's wrong with me that nobody wants me? I think I'm a good person. I want to be accepted. I want to be part of a group. It's tough. I have a ton of, maybe next year, I don't know, maybe I'll start some crap where it's like heterosexuals fighting for LGBTI rights or something. I don't know, I'll do something. But I don't, me personally, I like doing the lectures and stuff, but I'm starting to realize maybe I should take this to the streets and organize some crap or figure something out. Because people need not to feel that they're bad people because you happen to like a dude of the same sex or a chick who's the same sex as you. It's completely freaking ridiculous to me, right? So anyway, that's the end of that. That completes this section of my discussion what's the name of this thing I'm doing? I can't remember the name of this. I can never remember. Introduction to Methods of Qualitative Research. I will continue with section 1.6. I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell. Thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. Have a good day.